It's beginning to look a lot like madness. Ugh, that's a lame intro, but it's a genuine intro because with football now done, as the Eagles dominated the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl, we pivot to the future of college basketball, and right around the corner is March Madness, and we're going to have two very competitive teams in this state that are going to be playing in March and hopefully making deep runs in March. So today we're going to be talking to Greg Waddell, personal friend, also friend of the program now, with him having been on the show. We're going to be talking of Sleepers Media. Obviously, we're going to be talking a ton of college basketball, mainly Michigan, Michigan State, and just kind of the outlook for the Big Ten. Really looking forward to kind of picking his brain about where the sport is at, where these programs are at, because I think that I predicted it to be a fun year, but I think the process has been accelerated. The fact that you see these two teams where they're at right now, playing really competitive basketball as the favorites to potentially win the Big Ten. I mean, we are looking at a collision course where that final game between Michigan and Michigan State at the Breslin Center has Big Ten championship implications. That's really exciting to think about. So we're going to be talking all about that with Greg today. But before we get into that, just a few programming notes. Look, if you're watching this and you're saying, look, I like this Castellani guy, he's okay. And I like his content, that's also okay. But what would happen if we combine those? There is a place where you can figure that out. You go to CastellaniContent.com. There you will find the links. It is, I've never described a website as this, at least one that, you don't have to be 18 years or older to go to. It's a sexy website. I mean, it's a beautifully designed website. I wish I could take credit for the design. I can't. I'm not that intelligent, but it's beautifully put together. We're updating it all the time. I'll say this is archived. Chris and Company is archived. The post-game videos are archived. I'm giggling because I'm being silly. But you could go there. All that stuff is there. One click away. Probably going to have a few more movie-related things coming out here soon as we get close to the Oscars. I want to watch a few more of the Oscar movies. I'll take a nice week and a half out of my schedule to watch The Brutalist at some point. So, yeah, we're diversifying here on the Chris Castellani platform. So, yeah, obviously you can find us on Twitter at Castellani2014. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I want to get the watch hours up on YouTube, and I know I focus in on that, but I noticed that a lot of the people that watch my YouTube channel are not subscribed. So, what the hell, people? Go to YouTube, hit that subscribe button, little bell. You see that little bell notification? Bing! And that way you are notified every single time that we upload a video to YouTube. And you get to see my face and the beautiful face of whoever my guest is when we have them on the podcast. So, yeah, let's jump right into it. College hoops talk here. Michigan and Michigan State, top of the Big Ten, perfectly balanced as all things should be. Let's get to our conversation with Greg Waddell. Chris and Company continues, and it's all college basketball for the most part this week as Michigan and Michigan State. It feels like the good old days. I said this on I'll Say This, Greg, where it's like after some tumultuous times for Michigan, it felt right in mid-February to be kind of scoreboard watching, checking to see what other teams in the Big Ten are doing, looking at two teams in this state that are at the top of the Big Ten standings. It's fun. So we're talking college basketball with Greg Waddell from Sleepers Media. I guess for the sake of continuity and potentially inside jokes, I do need to point out the fact that we've known each other since I was like 5 or 6 years old or younger. We went to high school together. We played high school tennis together. So just throwing it out there for the people. But obviously, you've gone on to much bigger and better things with Sleepers. Greg, what's up, man?
What up, dude? I must say, I was back at Lansing Catholic for the first time in like 6 years last week. I went to see the high school hoops team, and the first thing I did was walk through the halls, and don't worry, our names are still on a couple trophies in the trophy case. So it's good to be with a fellow champion, Chris. Good to see you, man.
As well as they should be, Greg. I appreciate that. No, that's fantastic to hear. I haven't been back in a minute. I don't even know if I've been to like the revamped gym and everything. I do want to get down there at some point for sure. So yeah, two prides of Lansing Catholic coming at you today. Let's jump right into it, man. Obviously Michigan State after Michigan with a 2-0 week. MSU goes 1-1, but has just a massive second half surge to knock off Oregon after trailing by as much as 16, I believe, in the first half. So we find ourselves really in a three-way race. I think that it's a competitive Big Ten, but right now I think there is that first tier. And I'll just throw the question out to you to start. Who's the best team in the Big Ten?
I think Purdue is the best team in the Big Ten. I don't think it's by a sizable gap, but they have the best player in this league. They have the only guy in this league that I think you can feel extremely terrified giving a different answer. Like, respect to whoever Michigan State's best player is any given night. It was Jace Richardson. He was spectacular against Oregon, and they can beat you in numbers. Respect to Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden. Respect to Yakashonis at Illinois. Like, there's just nobody else that can do what Braden Smith can do. And on certain nights, Trey Kaufman-Renn becomes their featured guy and Braden takes a back seat. There's no one else in the sport that's as good as him that would ever take a back seat to anybody. So they're a formidable duo. And he's a killer. I mean, let's not forget, he was the point guard that was unheralded, 3-star, comes in with Zach Edey, and it kind of got lumped into the Zach Edey era. Everyone just gave Edey all the credit. Oh. But Braden Smith is every bit the winner, the champion that Edey was. And it was last season. I mean, I was in the building for it in Champaign against Illinois. Big Ten title on the line. It was Braden Smith shooting a step back 3 while Zach Edey watched over Terrence Shannon Jr. and then pointing at his wrist and saying, I got ice in the veins. So that dude's a stone cold killer. I think Purdue has the best coach in the league right now, the best point guard in the league right now. And they have to go at Michigan State, at Illinois down the stretch. So they will be tested, but I think they're probably the inside track to win this thing.
Are you surprised that you're saying this at this point in the season, given what Purdue lost coming off of last year's, national championship run?
I'm not. I think preseason I would not have been surprised to say it at this point, but how they got here, yes, is very surprising because this team had no idea what they wanted to be in November, and part of that was forced, but they had a freshman center named Daniel Jacobson, stud, starts on Team USA at his level, and he got hurt in the first game of the year. And a season-ending injury, like there's your starting center. You have no answers. Yeah. That's really tough. And Painter tried to bring in a couple different guys that just didn't work. And he kind of took a month figuring it out. And he's leaning on a lot of freshmen off the bench. Guys that we thought would take leaps haven't. And guys that we didn't think would take leaps have. But by the end of January, really, he had completely molded this team from a team that was very passive defensively to a team that just pressures the crap out of your guards for 40 minutes. And it works. We saw Michigan succumb to that on the road. Trey Donaldson had like 3 turnovers for layups in the first 4 minutes of that game in Mackey Arena. And I think it's a great testament to what Painter is, where there's a lot of coaches who are so hard-nosed on this is what I do. I will never change. Matt Painter changes every single week to put his team in the best spot. And I think big picture, not all that surprised, but the way they got here is stunning.
Well, I want to ask one more Purdue question, and it is about Matt Painter, just because, I think the guy, you look at it, and they were showing the all-time Big Ten wins list among coaches with Izzo obviously tying Bobby Knight. Matt Painter's right in there. I mean, Matt Painter's had a remarkable run. Until last year, there was this kind of tarnished legacy with the postseason failures. Do you feel like the criticism prior to last year regarding maybe the lack of adjustments or what he wasn't able to do in NCAA tournament games was legitimate, or did you always feel like it was somewhat overblown?
I think the results were legitimate. So it's hard to say like the criticisms aren't legitimate, but it's one of my biggest gripes with the way college basketball is talked about at large is people put too much emphasis on what happens in a tournament that is extremely fluky.
Yeah.
Like it is a lot better representation of what a player or a coach or a program is to look at 30 game sample sizes instead of a 1 game sample size. And I understand that's not how sports work. You are ultimately defined by your accomplishments in the games that matter the most. But it's just not all that surprising to see great programs or great teams lose and come up short before they win. Like Bill Self for the longest time had like a 10-year reputation of being a loser in March because he lost to Northern Iowa before they were winning games. And it's something that bites everybody. John Calipari just ran out of town after winning titles because of shortcomings in 1 game sample sizes. And if you go back through a lot of these Purdue results, some of them are definitely embarrassingly bad for some great teams, but they were a shot away from the Final Four with Carson Edwards a couple years ago, where a miracle Virginia buzzer beater led them to a national championship. And I always caution people, don't make sweeping judgments of who a player, a coach, or a program is because of NCAA tournament results. It's just too fluky, and that's what we love about it.
Yeah, and I think it's ironic you bring up the Virginia game, because I think Tony Bennett is a prime example of that, where Tony Bennett had a million tournament flops. I mean, to double-digit seeds, blowing late leads, first one seed to lose to a 16, and yet they had that run in 19 where it took like 3 or 4 miracle shots just for them to even be in the Final Four, let alone win the national championship. And obviously, it's like his resume is all of a sudden clean because of that one, a pretty remarkable run. I think it's very similar with Painter. To make a baseball analogy, it's like how prior to last year, people talked about that with the Dodgers, where it's like, well, they always lose in the postseason. It's like, yeah, but if you're a GM, you're going to assemble every year. You're going to take a team that's winning 100 games. Like, I understand there's a randomness to the postseason. Like you said, that is why we love it. I want to move on to some Michigan and Michigan State talk, as they also sit atop the Big Ten, which is very fun to see. I just want to ask you, what were your original thoughts on the Dusty May hire? Because he was somebody that I honed in on pretty early on, and you probably had much better reasons than I did, but my whole thing was like, dude took Florida Atlantic to a Final Four. Like, he's clearly knows what he's doing. But I guess, did you feel like this would be a solid fit, or did you have some concerns?
Yeah, I thought it was a great fit. I thought Michigan was really fortunate to get him, honestly, because, coming into last season, I think had Dusty May chosen to leave after his Final Four immediately, he would have been the hottest name available. And I think he still was and still should have been considered the hottest name available after, it was a good season last year. They lost in the round of 32, or I believe actually the first round of the tournament. Yeah, against
Northwestern, right? Yeah.
But they that wasn't a disappointing season, even if it was a disappointing March result. And Dusty is such a logic-driven man, which is interesting now with the Indiana job opening and people speculating if he's interested or not. Like, he's always been a guy that is just rooted in his foundation of like what is smart for his basketball program, what works for players. You don't see him stomping around, pouting on the sideline when things go wrong. It's just very methodical. And he was offered Louisville, which a lot of people would have considered a better, bigger job than Michigan. And he turned it down because he thought the fit was better at Michigan. And I think that speaks to his approach on things. He's kind of going to do what he believes works best for his belief system. And it's been a great fit. It was always going to be hard to come in after Juwan because of how just bare it was roster-wise and how many players were looking to leave. And it shouldn't be lost on people how impressive Dusty did in the portal. I mean, that's not how he built his Florida Atlantic teams. Like, it wasn't full of incredible transfers. Vlad Golden transferred into FAU, but he hit on a lot of under the radar recruits, and for him to bring Vlad with him, but to land Danny Wolf without anybody even really getting a chance at Danny Wolf is like a wildly impressive recruiting win to me. Donaldson's been better than Bill in the offseason. So yeah, I would say I had high expectations, but did I expect to be tied for first in the Big Ten in the middle of February? Even that seems crazy to me coming into this season.
Yeah, I had high expectations for the tenure, but as you brought up, I mean, it was such an uphill battle with the fact that you're coming off of an 8-win team. The only members of that 8-win team that were like legit contributors, sans Will Cheddar, all left, or were no longer a part of the program. So I was excited just in general and appreciated the way that he just ate in the portal. I mean, to build an entire roster through the portal the way he did, I thought was very impressive. And, flaws and all, like, he's gotten these guys to buy in very quickly. My expectation was just like, I hope that this can be a team that's playing competitive basketball in February, March, and they're well beyond that. I mean, they're going to be a tournament team, which is fun to see. But, you bring up obviously how kind of methodical he is. And I agree. Like, he's a logic driven guy. He's a very sharp guy. You could tell he's been around the game for a long time. And you see in these moments when Michigan is this well-oiled machine, the way that they can operate and the way that I feel like just from a matchup standpoint, they can be a nightmare with the number of shooters they have, the number of scorers that they have. But, and I got to ask about this, there is that problem that rears its ugly head basically every game, even in the wins, which is I call it the stretch, which is it starts with turnovers and then it defaults to missed shots or failure to efficiently run the offense. But let's just focus on the turnovers for now, because I've always felt this way with Izzo's program as well, which is I'm willing to deal with maybe an above average amount of turnovers when you're moving at a pace where you're going to run, because you're going to end up getting quick baskets. You're going to end up scoring. You're going to outrun the other team. I can deal with that, the occasional bad pass. How much of Michigan's turnover problem is the pace they play at, and how much of it is just sloppiness?
I want to say it's mostly slop, but I do think pace induces slop because, Dusty gives his players a lot of freedom. And it's part of what makes his brand of basketball fun to watch. Like, it's weird to say, but like, this is so polar opposite from what Beeline ball was.
Yes.
And it's funny because there are a lot of people who try to say that Dusty's like a lot like John Beeline. They couldn't be more different from a basketball philosophy standpoint. John Beeline is like ripping what's left of his hair out watching this team turn the ball over the way they are. And there's not one way to win or lose basketball games, but the way Dusty's teams are built and the way they play is definitely frustrating when they lose, because they've had a double-digit point lead in 4 of their 5 losses this year. The only game they've really gotten outplayed was the Purdue loss. So, I think when you actually watch some of the turnovers, like Danny Wolf has kind of gotten a lot better at this lately. He has 4 straight games with 2 or less turnovers, and it hasn't corresponded with Michigan like solving the blown lead problem. They're winning these games, but they're still doing the same things where they blow a 12-point lead. Right. It's just not happening the same way. And Donaldson's turnovers have seemingly gotten worse while Danny's have gotten better. So I don't think there's a lot of rhyme or reason to it, other than realistically Wolf and Donaldson are 2 guys that make some boneheaded plays over the span of 40 minutes. And you kind of have to live with it at this point if you're Michigan. And I think Dusty would say, look, can we clean it up? Yeah. But the goal is to be the better team by 1 possession or more over 40 minutes. And 18 out of 23 times they found a way to do that, which is impressive, even if it's frustrating.
And in fairness, I brought this up on my other show this week. In 4 recent wins, going back to the Northwestern win, even with the turnover problems and even with that stretch of kind of sloppiness, they've done a really good job of finishing. That's the bizarre thing with this team, is that they'll panic when they're up 10-15 and then they'll settle down in really close games, which is what they did against Indiana. It's what they did against Oregon. How much of the maybe miscommunication at points on the offensive end of the floor do you feel like is related to the fact that this is a team made up almost entirely of guys who hadn't played together before this year?
Probably a little bit. And it's an unconventional way to play basketball, right? Like we don't often see teams play 2 7-footers, let alone a guy who's essentially a 7-foot point guard. And at the same time that you're playing 2 7-footers, you're also trying to play extremely fast. Like that, none of those things mesh, right? Normally teams that would play too big want to play slow and plot it through the post. And that's just the opposite of what Michigan does. So it's got to be an adjustment. I look at a guy like Roddy Gale, who's really struggling right now. He's going through it. And I think there's some things that he struggled with this year that are on tape that you saw at Ohio State. And then there's also the reality that he's playing as bad as he can play in a new way. Like he was never this frustrating at Ohio State. And, I try to remember okay, he's being asked to basically play a 4th or 5th option role when he was kind of more featured on the ball at times at Ohio State. And he's playing next to these 2 bigs. He has no idea how to play next to 2 7-footers. And there's sort of just a lot of pressure on you if you're one of the 5 guys on Michigan that are expected to play 30 minutes a game. And there's no depth here. Like the bench has really become unplayable. So it makes your mistakes really magnified. And I think if they had a little extra depth, if they had a 6th or 7th guy off the bench that you trusted, you wouldn't notice some of the errors as much. The reality is there's a lot on Trey Donaldson and Danny Wolf's plate every single game. And I think over the course of the season, both have been pretty spectacular, even if they've had some loud moments. Donaldson's exceeded my expectations. Wolf's been one of the best players in the country at his best. And got to remember, Wolf was the Ivy League Player of the Year or a first-team All-Ivy League guy last year. Trey Donaldson wasn't even a trusted starter where he's coming from. So inconsistency kind of comes with who some of these players are.
You mentioned the bench, and that is one of the, I would say, the biggest difference between Michigan and Michigan State, as we'll talk about later, is the fact that one team has tremendous depth. One team, I have my concerns. Cheddar's had a wonderful year off the bench, and he's been a key contributor, but I do think the deeper you get into the season, you are going to look for that second, third option off the bench. Who do you think currently on the roster is most likely, if it's there, to take that next step and be a contributor down the stretch coming off the bench for Dusty May?
It's Cheddar, but the issue for Michigan is that Cheddar can't play with Danny and Vlad.
Yeah.
So you end up with this guy who's like a great bench piece, and I give him all the credit in the world. I've really loved watching what he's done this year.
Me too.
And talk about a culture program guy who like went through all that he did the last 2 years, was honestly like the butt of a lot of jokes about it. Like I made jokes in front of Will Cheddar to his face when he came on our NBA draft show in the summer. And all he's done is like spit out this awesome leadership role season where he's been great on the court. But yeah, the issue is like, if he's on the court, that means one of Danny or Vlad are off the court. So it leaves you with no backup that you trust for any of the guard spots. And I think it's got to be Reuben Jones if it is somebody that steps up. But I'd be lying to you if I said I have any reason to believe that Reuben Jones is going to magically turn into something he hasn't been for 4 months at this point. Yeah. That one just feels like a misevaluation by Dusty.
Do you feel like he sticks with Reuben Jones starting again like he did against Indiana, or do you feel like that was a short-term thing?
I would stick with it just because I think the concept here is that Roddy Gale, even when he's playing better than he has been, kind of when he's on the court with the starters, encourages Trey Donaldson to be more passive. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear at this point that Donaldson and Wolf need to be the drivers of the action almost every possession for this team. So if you put in a role player who's really just there to play defense, like Reuben, or even Sam Walters, a guy who's out there to just make shots, I think it puts more on the plate of the guys you want the food on the plate of. Roddy, to me, he needs a step back. And if he does get going, putting him on those bench lineups could be good for him because he kind of gets to be the featured guy and be more aggressive in those moments. So I like the adjustment from Dusty. I do think it sticks.
Yeah, I don't mind it either. And I think you do get, because the one thing Roddy Gale can do every so often is score. And I like the idea of having that energy off the bench. And one player, because you brought up Gale a minute ago and just kind of his struggles. One player that he reminds me of a bit. Now, he's not the defender, the lockdown defender this guy was, but like the first year of Charles Matthews, where it's like you could tell there's a very good player in here somewhere and there's a very good athlete. And every so often he could take over, control a game, obviously great defender, but then he would do shit like just dribble off his foot or travel, lead the country in travels. If that was a real statistic, it was bizarre. And then, kind of brought it together in the, in the tournament that year. But I think, there's a really good scorer in there and a good player in there somewhere. I do think that the system he's a part of, where, like you say, he's kind of that fourth or fifth option, has maybe frustrated him a bit. I think that one of the many things about this Michigan team that is very dangerous and good is the number of scorers they have, like I said. And so I'm not going to ask who the best player is on this team because I feel like it can change any given night. But if all things go well for Dusty May's team, who should be the best player on this team come March?
It's hard. It's hard to define what best player means because to me, the best player is Danny Wolf, and they're going to go as far as Danny Wolf takes them. But I think Danny Wolf playing the best he can play might be the third leading scorer on this team. Mm-hmm. Like, I think you want Vlad Golden scoring 24 points if he can. And most of those points are created directly from Danny Wolf throwing lobs to him. And if Danny's operating as the rebounder facilitator he is, maybe he ends up with 14 points, 12 rebounds, 7 assists. And you're like, whoa, how did that 7-footer do that? Meanwhile, Donaldson and Vlad are like at 18 and 20 points a game. That's sort of the recipe for me. And again, it's so unique. Like it's very rare that you would say like, oh yeah, our best player is going to be our third leading guy. But that's what you want from Michigan from a scoring standpoint. And I think at their best, that's what Danny's been. Like he's a very unselfish player that is just so hard to stop and creates advantages for everyone else. But ultimately they're going to go where he takes them. And I think you don't see Vlad go crazy individually without Danny making it happen. We've seen a couple games where Trey Donaldson pops off seemingly on his own, but it's going to be Danny.
I would agree. And I think that I see the point you're making about how being the, quote unquote best player doesn't always correlate to being the best scorer. Cause I feel like sometimes where he's gotten himself into trouble is he's felt this need to try to take over games. And that's where we lead to the turnover problems. And I think when the offense is running consistently and they're getting good looks, and he kind of lets the game come to him, and he can be a dominant player. Like down the stretch against Indiana, he was brilliant. Let's transition now to the other team that is rolling here in this state, and that's Michigan State. Because you said something. I've been meaning to honestly ask you this question for months. And I think I even bookmarked the tweet because you said something early on in this season, and I don't have the exact quote, but it was something like, "This is the least Tom Izzo team that Michigan State has seen in a long time." And just viewing them through the eyeball test, I agree with that, but I can't quite put my finger on exactly what that means. From your perspective, what does it mean for this team to be different than a lot of other Izzo teams?
Yeah, it's a quote that I'll be honest with you, like I wouldn't make today. It's that their season has shape shifted so much that, looking back, that's probably one of the major misses in the way I've covered Michigan State has been. But what I meant by it at the time was just like, I think of Michigan State basketball teams as like these physically imposing monster brutality front courts that just are always the bigger, more athletic, stronger team. That's what I grew up with. I'm sure that's what you grew up with. It was 2 decades of that. And even if these last 3 years Michigan State underachieved, like I think at times you still felt like the guys that were on the court were that mold. Whereas this team, I mean, they start 3 very small guards. They start 2 bigs that are undersized. I mean, Zapala is 7-footer. I guess he's not undersized, but he's been unplayable. He's been a step backwards from Sissoko. So they end up closing games with Frankie Fidler and Carson Cooper. And I think part of my frustration when I said that in November was that Frankie Fidler was playing huge minutes for this team. And Frankie Fidler offensively is trying to get to the free throw line. Mm-hmm. I mean, he does not do anything on the basketball court other than try to jump into people and get to the free throw line. and he's damn good at it. Like that's the scout from him at Omaha. So me personally, I had not ever seen a player that does what Frankie Fidler does featured on a Michigan State team, let alone a team that does that while also being really undersized. And, when they were struggling, that's sort of how I framed it. I think what's been interesting since is they've gone almost completely away from Fidler. Now he's had some good minutes off the bench for this team at times, but they've really embraced a tenacious lineup of Akins and Holloman and Fears, just embracing this like underdog against the world. We're going to pressure you for 40 minutes and cause you nightmares. And I think it's worked. And I think weirdly enough, that flip is something that is very Michigan State, right? Like we're now very aggressive and defensive oriented. And Cohen Carr, of course, is one of the most athletic players in the country. So, in hindsight, do I wish I had framed it the way I did? No. But I think the personnel groupings have changed for this team that do remind me a lot more of the throwback Michigan State teams than they did at the beginning of the season.
I think they've molded themselves into a team that looks more like a traditional Michigan State team over the last several weeks or months. Because I think, and we'll talk about exactly what happened, but over the last few years, a lot of people point to the guard play, and that's, we'll discuss that. But Michigan State teams at their best just dominate you on the glass, and nothing comes easy against them defensively. And I think that early on in the campaign, we really didn't have a sense of how deep this team could be in the kind of big by committee, system that they've had throughout this season. As far as Izzo is concerned, it seems like he's adapted. It seems like he's in a great place right now. The program's in a great place. It's funny because when you take a coach who's had so much success, and then you have 4 years where maybe things aren't as the lights aren't as bright as they were. But when you break down those 4 years, they weren't losing in the CBI. Like they were losing second round of the NCAA tournament, Sweet 16 in 1 year when they beat Marquette. Like it was still a legitimate program. But there were some concerns and there were some criticisms and frustrations. Do you feel like some of the concerns people had about Izzo over the last several years were legitimate, or do you think it was just a matter of the program kind of finding its footing again?
It's a good question. I think I think they were legitimate, and I think Michigan State fans might want to fight me on that, given how this season has played out. Certainly, like Izzo has proved me wrong and proved a lot of the critics wrong. But I think the issue for his teams the last couple of years, again, back to the 30-game sample size more than the March sample size.
Right.
They weren't getting March results either, but he had 3 straight years of losing. Well, 4 straight years of losing 13 games.
Yeah.
Has that ever happened to Michigan State since I've been a kid? Like, no, it hasn't. So those teams were, I think, closer to the bubble than people wanted to admit. And when you try to diagnose, like, why was that happening? Well, the shift coincided with COVID and with the transfer portal and with NIL really changing the landscape of the sport. And a lot of coaches from Izzo's era said they don't want to play the game and left the game in the last 4 years. So I don't think it was unreasonable to think Izzo might go that same route. He's still not a huge proponent of what transfers do to this sport. And I think the elephant in the room was he's missed on a lot of his primary high school targets the last 4 years, which have made it louder on his transfer mistakes. And this year's team, look, when you bring in a freshman like Jace Richardson, there's not much to say. Like you don't need transfers when you bring in a kid like that that's clearly so ready. And he's done a good job developing too. Like Jeremy Fears coming off the injury that he had. Trey Holloman's just gotten better and better. So, it's hard to knock. It's a huge feather in Izzo's cap that he's done it the way he said he could do it when everybody criticized him for it. But I think over the last 4 years leading up to this year, it was totally fair to criticize. Just like this year, it would be really unfair to criticize him at all. He's been spectacular this season.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think you kind of have to go on a team-by-team basis of what exactly happened, because I think the first 2 years post Cassius Winston, it was as simple as they put their faith in some point guards that just weren't quite prepared or ready to play, Big Ten basketball. I mean, you hand the keys over to Foster Loyer, it doesn't quite work. Hoggard showed flashes, and then you could tell last season very early on that there was a lot of frustrations that Izzo had with the point guard play, and obviously the big guys down low. When I had Graham Couch on, he brought up the fact that, as you kind of alluded to, the Gabe Brown recruiting class especially, they weren't failures or awful, but just probably did not live up to the hype that people had for them. And ultimately it kind of felt for several years like they were stuck in one gear. You mentioned the portal, and I'm very I still am kind of figuring out what his stance on this is completely, because there were interviews that I watched with Izzo where he genuinely sounded like he would rather die than use the portal. And then and early, with I want to try to avoid it, or these people got to learn how to fail. And then I pointed out 2 years ago when they made their run to the Sweet 16, I'm like, man, your 2 best players you got in the portal. I mean, Tyson Walker carried you, and Joey Hauser had a wonderful senior season shooting the ball. And now you add Fiddler and a few other guys that are coming in. Do you feel like his stance on the portal has changed, or was he maybe never as stingy about it as he may have let on?
I mostly think he's still as stingy about it, to be honest. I think the reality of this sport right now is that there are sort of times that you have to do things you don't want to do. And Izzo, maybe as stubborn as I would like to think Izzo is based on his actions and words in the last couple of years, one thing I will never deny is that guy is a competitive psychopath. Yeah. I mean, if he's given 2 options and it's go down with the ship or adjust, he's going to adjust because he's a Hall of Fame coach that wants to win. He's about to set the all-time Big Ten wins record. Like, there's no possible way for a critic of Tom Izzo to deny how great of a coach he is. So I think to that point, he got so frustrated with Hoggard. And the forgotten guy that he got frustrated with, honestly, is Mady Sissoko.
Right.
He opened the door to bringing Mady back in a way that he didn't for AJ. But the reality is, the last 3 years were the Sissoko-Hoggard era. Mady started 2 years at center, failed, and AJ wasn't good enough at point guard. And Izzo's kind of pinned that down as what went wrong. Let's get new guys in. And he had to go to the portal because he hasn't been landing his recruits at the big man spot. So, I think there are Michigan State fans still here today, as good as the season has gone, that would say, man, imagine if we had spent big money on a big-time center.
Yeah.
That's not what happened. He didn't have crazy competition for Shimon Zapala, and Zapala largely has been unplayable for the last month. So did he check the box of getting a transfer? Yeah. Is the Michigan State program and the resources it has capable of portaling better than that? 100%. And I think that's the issue. Like, they got a $7 million donation from the Ishbia family in the fall that is directly supposed to go to whatever Tom Izzo wants it to go to. Where is it going would be my question. Because, like, if Tom Izzo does figure out how to portal in the mix with everything else he's doing, there's no reason this team shouldn't be winning the Big Ten year after year after year right now.
Yeah, and I think going back to the point you made about Sissoko and Hogarth, I think it was kind of two different things. Where Sissoko, you could tell he was not developing the way that Izzo wanted him to, and I think he got very stubborn. With Hogarth, it seemed for a while like there was this upward trajectory, then he just kind of plateaued. I don't know if that was more mental, more psychological, but there was clear frustration, relatively early on in that campaign. Yeah, it's an issue that I think is going to be a big question mark for Michigan State athletics across the board over the next half decade or so. Is what are your resources for NIL? How are you spending that money? Because, you brought it up with the portal and the guys they bring in. To make another baseball analogy, it's like when the Tigers sign a guy to a 1-year deal, and it's like, okay, yes, you utilize the free agent market. I'm not giving you like extra points for just bringing in a guy. We're talking about going out and getting big names for, large amounts of money. I do think that move is still yet to be made with Izzo, but obviously up to this point, first place in the Big Ten, it's working out. You mentioned Beilein a few times throughout this, and obviously he's on Big Ten Network now. And I don't know if he's ever talked about this specifically, but with, as you said, guys like Tony Bennett and Jay Wright, Jim Larinaga kind of stepping aside and saying, this era of college basketball isn't so much for me. Do you feel like Beilein would have embraced the challenges that came with this era, or do you feel like he would have been another one of those that felt like the game, not that the game passed him by, but maybe that the sport itself had changed to a point where he didn't really want to adapt to it?
I think he would have surprised people there, to be honest. I think if John Beilein still had his way, I think he'd still be coaching. And I know that's easy to say as like a Michigan fan, but like, he didn't think he'd be out of an NBA job within a year when he took that. And when he got out of Cleveland quickly, like the rumor was he really wanted a coaching job and almost was going to coach at West Virginia again. So I think as much as he's around the game and probably happy to be working with Big Ten Network a little bit, I think he misses it. So I don't know what he would have done. I don't know if he would have been good at it at all, but I know this, like, as you've seen with football, the University of Michigan has no shortage of people that want to spend money on sports. Mm-hmm. And like it or not, like John Beilein had built that into a place where people had a certain level of trust of what he was going to do with the team year after year. So coming off of multiple national title appearances in a decade span, like he really did leave at the height of his powers. If NIL had come in when that was going on, I don't think it would have been all that hard for John Beilein to get serious money. And to me, Beilein was never a guy that was really opposed to transfers. Like he brought in players from the transfer portal when they had to sit a year. So I think he would have been better than people expected. I do think younger coaches that kind of were brought up in this era are inherently better at it just because they don't know any better. They're kind of taught that this is how you're supposed to work. Whereas guys from Beilein and Izzo's era are more like, I'm supposed to have my summers off. What is this? But ultimately, Beilein was a good enough coach that I think he would have figured it out.
He adapted so consistently throughout his career that I have hope that he would have been able to do it again. I mean, when you look at the way that the offense was constructed when he arrived here and how important the three ball was. I mean, they after a year, I think it was 3, they going into 2011, they completely revamped the offense. Then all of a sudden, late in his tenure, they became a top 5, top 10 defensive efficiency team in the entire country. When they bring in Yaklich, I have confidence he would have adapted there. I think that I imagine the way he would have used the portal would have been interesting because Beilein was the master. I mean, he was as good as anyone at this, of taking guys that were these projects and turning them into stars. So I could have, much like with his recruiting, I could have seen him going out and grabbing somebody from a smaller school that you didn't think much of, and then 2 years later they're, the number 15 pick in the draft. So it would have been interesting. I just think, and as some of these other coaches have alluded, like, you have to be more committed than you've ever been to stay competitive in the modern age of college basketball. And that's not to say that you could half-ass it in the past, but like, Larinaga made a great point when he stepped down. He's like, we made the Final Four and we had 8 guys that went into the portal after making the Final Four. Like, that's just something that is a completely different animal than it was even 4-5 years ago. Kind of taking a step back and looking at the rest of the Big Ten, because I think there's been so much focus on that top tier, but I've watched a fair amount of Big Ten basketball this year, and really I bring it up all the time, man. If you go out and win on the road against the last ranked team in the Big Ten, I'm still going to give you a thumbs up. Like, this is a tough league to win in. There's a lot of depth here. There's a lot of competitiveness here. Who's a team currently in the Big Ten that might not be at the top of the standings, but you feel like has a very high ceiling and could potentially be a very difficult outcome, March?
I think there's 2. I like Maryland and I like Illinois. I'll start with Maryland because I think they have sort of earned this nod more than Illinois has, where they have been very good all season long. They have a bunch of close losses. Like their largest loss was by 6 points. I mean, wow. Everything's been within 2 possessions. They haven't gotten blown out once. And some of those games were against really quality opponents. Like, they almost beat Purdue at Mackey Arena and it lost at home to Marquette, a game they led much of back in the non-con. They are, much like Michigan, really hard to deal with inside. They play 2 legitimate big men. Julian Reese has been one of the better bigs in the Big Ten for 4 years, and now he's their second best big next to an NBA future star, I think, in Derek Queen, who, kind of like Danny Wolf, is a 7-footer that can do a lot of guard-like basketball things on the floor. And then they just surround him with 2 knockdown shooters on the wings and a point guard from the portal in Jacoby Gillespie that has sort of hit his stride recently in a way he wasn't playing in November. So their issue is depth. They really only play 5 players. And if anything goes wrong with one of those 5 players, it's hard for them to overcome. But that's not a team, like if you're like a 8 seed and you see Maryland as a 9 seed in your first game, you're absolutely dreading that matchup. And then Illinois has to be mentioned here. Now, I mentioned Maryland earned mention. Illinois hasn't, because they have been so up and down. Yeah. They should be better than their record is. KenPom has them as the 14th best team in the country, and they're 16-8. And some of it's their fault, some of it's not. They have had so much adversity from injuries and guys in and out of the lineup. But at the same time, this is a team that's shooting 31% from 3 on the year and built themselves to be this crazy 3-point chucking team that wanted to run up and down and shoot more threes than their opponent every single game. They've just started to pivot their identity. They've put 2 bigs into the starting lineup and kind of leaned into the size that they have, be more physical, play inside out. And they have the star power. Like, the Kasparas Akashonis is sensational. And at his best, he's a top 5 player in the entire sport. So, they're one of those teams. It does, oddly enough, it reminds me of a couple Michigan teams in the last 2 years where you always knew the talent was there, but the game results just didn't show it. And if it clicks at the right time, no one's going to be surprised to see this team in a Final Four, but we're waiting for it to click still, and they're finally healthy. So my prediction is they're going to have a pretty big February here and earn a lot of people's respect back.
Yeah, I could see that. And Underwood's done such a good, consistent job. And it seemed like last year, you bring up how important like the 30-game results kind of speak more to what team actually is. But prior to last year, obviously Underwood had his issues, getting out of the first weekend and make the Elite 8 last year, kind of get that monkey off their back. I agree with you on Maryland. I like their shooters. I like Willard as a coach. And it's fun. I don't know if you get this or if it's just my Twitter feed. I always feel like Maryland fans never like their head basketball coach. Is that a thing that do you get that as well, or is that just my feed?
No, I think it's real. I mean, Turgeon, everybody hated Turgeon.
Yeah.
And I would argue Turgeon was like a very good coach. He always put good rosters together. But Willard, I don't know. What do you like about Willard? Because I think he's done a great job this year. I guess if there's anything to give him credit, he's like really learned from last year's mistakes and fixed them. But he strikes me as a guy that just like can put together good rosters, but in close game situations, I feel like his teams always make a bunch of mistakes, and I never know whether to blame him or his players. Yeah,
well, I mean, I always felt like Turgeon's teams did too at points. Yeah. Is that I felt like there was, even though, and I'd have to look at. I'm sure you have, better knowledge of the numbers than I do. I always thought that there was a sloppiness to some of those Turgeon teams that was very annoying, where they had tremendous talent on top, and they would have a consistent guard or really good shooters, but like late in games, they would struggle. They'd have sloppy turnovers. And offensively, I just felt like it was a lot of one-on-one, just not a whole lot of, movement. I feel like they've done a better job of cleaning that up, but even honestly, more so now, I just like the assembling of the roster, especially in the modern age, is so important. So I feel like that's been Dusty's biggest compliment this year, is the fact that he put together a roster that knows how to space the floor. I think in general, Maryland has been able to do that. In terms of the kind of the late game stuff, you never know with that, because it is a program that they haven't made a deep run in the tournament in a long time. So all it takes is two good games in the first weekend, and all of a sudden they're finally finding a way to close out games. And as you brought it up with Illinois, they're another team that's lost several games that could click in March. So yeah, I mean, we'll see, but I think that those are the two I would agree that come to mind. Wisconsin still is Wisconsin, and I don't even mean that as a negative, but Sands, well, I kind of do, because Sands, those 2 years with Bo Ryan, very solid in the regular season, most likely a first or second round out. Sands that really good run with Kaminsky and those guys. So I don't view them as a team with a super high ceiling. And as far as the bubble teams, one team that I feel like is, I don't know if they're that good, but consistently is kind of a thorn in people's side, is Ohio State. I don't know what to make of them, because I'll watch them. Sometimes I think they look awful, and then they go on the road and they win in Mackey. They have a miraculous win against Maryland. I mean, just coming back, they were down that entire game. They bank a 3 with seconds left. Just as a potential bubble team, I think that's one to look out for. But there's obviously a million teams, and that leads me to my next question. We talk about it in football all the time, but I feel like not enough attention was brought to what it meant for the basketball side of things. Do you like the Big Ten expansion? Are you used to it? Is it still something that you're adjusting to as a fan? What do you think?
I hate it personally. And I know there's a lot of smart basketball people that love it, and I can understand why people love it. I like watching UCLA as a program. Yeah. I love a lot of the teams that have been added. Oregon's a good add. I think Muss is going to be great at USC, and even Washington has some staying power if they get things right. But I hate in basketball. It's I guess it's the same in football, but in basketball, there's 20 games, and you're trying to determine who a champion is over a 20-game set. And certain teams have such easier schedule breaks than others. There's no way to legitimately make this fair on all 20 teams, adding these trips in and out of the West Coast, let alone trying to be a West Coast team trying to win this and going East 4 times in the year. So I don't like the super conference model in general. I think it's you might as well just make everybody independent if we're going to have conferences full of 30 teams.
Right.
To me, the West Coast teams should go to the WCC. Somebody revive the Pac-12. Yeah. I love watching them play basketball, but the fact that the Big Ten race is going to be decided by who doesn't have to go to Mackey Arena is really frustrating to me.
I get it.
It's not fair, in my opinion.
No, I get it, and I mean it's fair in basketball, but I mean the ultimate example. You look at another sport. I mean, really think Indiana was a playoff team, football? They very much lucked out by the fact that there's no Penn State on that schedule. There's no Oregon in that schedule. They played the worst Michigan team in a decade at home. And again, hey, you took advantage of it. I do get that. I guess more so from my perspective, I just liked and have always liked the regional aspect of college sports, and the fact that the Big Ten has an identity to it the same way the Pac-12 had an identity to it. And now it's you're kind of merging those worlds. There are elements to it that are cool. Just in principle, having Michigan State play UCLA in an arena in which Kareem and Magic are several feet from each other. That's just cool. Right. And that's probably something that we wouldn't get a whole lot of if one team was still in the Pac-12, but yeah, I mean, it's still weird. And the idea of, I was texting a friend about this, the fact that I now have 2 teams I have to worry about, both one in baseball, one in basketball, about, falling apart on West Coast trips is not something that I expected to be a thing in Big Ten basketball, and that is legitimate. So yeah, I'm with you. It'll be something I get used to, but yeah, I think that taking it a step further in terms of what it means for all sports, I'm glad Michigan football won their championship when they did, just because I view that as that was the last year of the college football that I grew up on. And I feel like we're kind of getting to a similar thing with basketball. And I do want to ask about just basketball as a whole, or where college basketball is at, because it's one of those things that I've had to go through this with baseball as well, where every year you read all these think pieces about, and people going on radio and sending out tweets about, what a messy place college basketball is in right now and how it's trending downward and there's no stars. And yet every year we run to the couch to watch the NCAA tournament. And it's like that in baseball. You have all these people complaining, these old heads are out. I will never watch if they institute a pitch clock. I'll never watch if they do this. And like the sport's in a really good place. I guess from your standpoint, what is the biggest, most legitimate problem that is plaguing college basketball right now?
The COVID year, which is almost gone. Like I'm very excited for that to end.
Yes, for Dickinson to be gone.
Yeah, it's crazy. And Dickinson becomes like the poster boy for it, which is funny just because he is the character that he is. But like there are so many fifth year guys that I think are half-assing this. And I don't even mean to say that Hunter is one of them, but like RJ Davis at North Carolina got a massive paycheck to return, and people were expecting him to be like a National Player of the Year candidate. And it's just clear that roster doesn't have what he needs. And he's seemed checked out for most of the season. Mark Sears has largely been really good, and Alabama's really good. He's also like been asked to come off the bench, and he was crying on the bench at one point. It's like there's just all this chaos from guys that are 23 years old that should either be playing in Europe or working at a law firm by now. And it makes no sense. It's dumb. And I understand why it was implemented because of unprecedented circumstances, but the sport will be in such a better place once it gets back to real college students playing college basketball. And I don't know, we're seeing the shift too. Like there's so many different ways to get players. You've got the guys who are just super old that are still here. You've got legitimate like transfers. You've still got the high school prep players coming in. And now you've got this huge surge of Europeans where people are going to watch what Kasparis Yakashonis has done at Illinois, what Yegor Devin's done at BYU. And I'll compare, there's a guy in Europe right now named Nolan Traore, who was consensus top 3 pick for next year's upcoming draft, that didn't come to college. He had offers from schools and said, no, I'm going to stay in Europe. And if you look at mock drafts now, he's fallen way behind Yakashonis and Devin. I think he's a better player, but he just didn't come to America and doesn't have the scouts on him every game. So I think we're going to see like the best Europeans try to come to college for a year now, knowing that they can get paid. And that's its own animal. Like Beeline was doing that a little bit with the Wagners before anybody even realized about it. Brad Underwood's making a killing off of this right now. So look, it's always going to evolve. People are always going to be looking for players. I weirdly enough think that money and the portal has actually evened the playing field a little bit.
I do too.
As crazy as that sounds, because I think you're seeing the big name schools spend money on players that are failing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hurt them. Like, look at Kansas this year. All of the biggest money paycheck guys they try to get have busted. So the opportunity's there. It's always going to be an entertaining sport. But, yeah, for me, it'll be a breath of fresh air just when we get rid of the 24-year-olds that are just here to cash one more paycheck.
Yeah, I mean, I think Caleb Love is another prime example of that as well. We're still a good player, but it's like, dude, I thought he was on the way out when they lost to Kansas like 3 years ago. It's crazy he's still there. I think that's all. Those are all fair points. And with the portal being what it is, I think it's a big thing. There's a lot of criticisms that people have of the sport that I'm just like, okay, yes, the replay reviews are annoying. I also want the calls to be correct. Like, I'm sorry. It sucks, right? Like to kind of delay a game that's supposed to be moving at a relatively fast pace, but that doesn't really, upset me or bother me by any means. So yeah, no, it'll continue to change and evolve and grow as it always has. And it still remains the most exciting postseason in sports. I hate to even ask it because I don't want to speak it into existence. How close do you think we're close to expansion for the tournament?
I do. Yeah, I think it's only a matter of time, and it'll break my heart slowly when it happens.
Yes.
The bubble this year is awful. Like Indiana is one of the first 4 teams out of the tournament right now, and they've won 1 game, I think, in a calendar month. Like the last thing we need is more teams, and I don't know. It's like football. You got to make the regular season matter a little bit, and it's hard enough to do that in a season with 30 games in it, but it's going to happen, and it's going to suck when it does.
I'm with you. It's inevitable, and the problem is when they expand to however many teams they get to 128, if it gets there. Just because, and I want to say this years in advance, just because we might get 124 seed that ends up making it to the Elite Eight doesn't validate the fact that it's a good idea. Like, I understand you add more teams, there's potentially more parity. That's all fine and fair. I think it's a perfect system right now where the regular season very much matters. And even I mean, I'm not just saying this because Ohio State won the national championship. I'm not crazy about the 12 team in college football for that reason, because I feel like from the era that we've grown up on, you lose to Ohio State, or you lose the Michigan Ohio State game and you go 10-2. Your season's a failure, and now you have an opportunity to play for a national championship. Not saying that like they're undeserving by any means. They had an incredible run, but I think we've started to do that more across all sports, where like the value of the regular season goes down consistently every single year, which is kind of frustrating. Yeah, I mean, that'll probably do it. I just want to say, just real quick, and I mean, I could text you this anytime, but I'll do it on the show. I'm proud of what you're doing, honestly, and what you've been continuing to do. And the more that I kind of try to continue to develop this, like, I've known you for a long time. You're a guy that knows sports, and you're a guy that knows how to talk about college basketball, and you've got a job doing that. And I respect the hell out of that for the people that grind. You've become a legitimate, I mean, you were always my legitimate source just because I knew you, but you've become a lot of people's legitimate source. You and Carter do a wonderful job. We'll make sure to link to everything you're doing with Sleepers Media. So thank you for coming on the show. One last thing, and we are pre-bracket, so I don't even necessarily like asking this question, but to put you on the spot. And I will make sure to promote the hell out of it if you turn out to be correct. Who's cutting down the nets at the end of, or I guess technically the beginning of April?
I think it's Duke. I think it is. I think they're clearly the best team in the sport, and everybody says it's Auburn or Duke. Duke beat Auburn. They played earlier this season. I watched that team be the better team. They have the best player. Cooper Flagg is a transcendent guy that we're going to look back on 10 years from now and think of him the same way we think of like a Kevin Durant type guy of like, wow, I can't believe he was in college. And that doesn't mean that they're going to win. Kevin Durant didn't win the national title, but that defense is for real. They have so many professional level defenders on that team. They nailed the transfer ads in terms of role players. They have a bunch of old guys. Mason Gillis was in the title game last year for Purdue, and he does a lot of the intangible things that this team needs. So I think it's a matter of time. Shire's been really good, and this is a good way to tie it all together from this. Shire hasn't had the March success yet, but he's had a bunch of teams good enough to do it. I think this is the year that he gets over the hump and cuts him down.
I think you're right. And even, I mean, the definition of Duke March success is different than others because he was in the Elite Eight last year. It's not like he's been a schlub by any means. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I feel like every 7-8 years we got to be due for another Duke title. But I get it. Cooper Flagg is incredible. Do you think we see a Big Ten team in the Final Four? And obviously, what the bracket looks like is so dependent on this. But just off, just what does your heart tell you?
My heart says no, but my heart hurts in saying that because I think there's 3 or 4 that have the upside to do it. Maybe 5 if you include Michigan, which we probably shouldn't. But let's be optimistic.
Their ceiling's super high. That's the thing. Is like if they limit the turnovers and play their best basketball, they can be a second, even third weekend team. I really.
Yeah, I'll say this. I think any of the 5 of Purdue, Maryland, Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois are good enough to get there as long as they don't have to see Auburn and Duke.
Fair.
At least one of those 2 will be in a bracket by themselves. So we'll see.
Right. Fair point. All right, man. Well, appreciate it, man, for doing this. We'll be in touch, and we'll have you on again here at some point soon. But appreciate all you're doing, and tell your family I said hi.
Yeah, anytime, Chris. Thanks, man. It was fun.
All right. Thank you, Greg. That was fun. I feel this is a weird thing that I do with the show, and maybe it's because this is the content where I talk the least, which should be the case because I'm interviewing somebody. I don't want to just steamroll somebody in the middle of an interview, but I come away from these episodes always feeling like I've learned something, whether it's about the sport or about another person. And yeah, I mean, that conversation was probably one that like Greg and I had in some capacity on the tennis courts circa like 2010, 2011, and now it's just recorded in podcast form for the entire world to see. Not sure, at least from my standpoint, if that's a good thing, but hopefully you guys enjoy. And obviously Greg and Carter, those guys do a wonderful job. So check out Sleepers Media. That will do it for this episode today as we continue to roll on with our episodes of Chris and Company and other podcasts and video content. You can go to castellanicontent.com. There you'll find the links to everything that we do. Beautifully organized, perfectly balanced, as I said earlier in the show. So very, very fun to see. Hit that subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter at Castellani2014. Yeah, this is, look, we've been very consistent with the uploading. This is the thing I do outside the Tiger videos. This is the thing that I make that I most consistently believe in, truly. And I think that we're getting good guests, and I think we're talking to smart people, and we're networking, and we're creating something that, well, I always want the numbers to do better, right? I'll just be real with you. I'm proud of. And you know what? 2 days ago, as of the time of this recording, we did our first ever Chris and Company episode. So we've really kind of come a long way in terms of the production side of things, and we've come a long way in terms of the guests. And I don't want to, I don't want to pat myself on the back by any means. I try not to do that, right? To avoid that hubris, but I've met, whether it's journalists or broadcasters, this has really kind of been a dream come true thing. I've always wanted to do an interview show, and the fact that, we've been able to say that we've talked to people that have covered these teams or played for these teams or won Cy Youngs for these teams is very, it's a humbling thing. And hopefully the next year of Chris and Company is going to be even better than the first year. So that's it for my soliloquy. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you very much to Greg for joining the program. We'll be back next week with another episode. Love you guys to death. Have a good one. Peace and happiness.
It's an unfair game. We got to think differently.